So we continue with our inputs for discussion with Maja Schlüter, who comes from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And as the title of her talk suggests, once we find it, it's about navigating the emergence of socio-ecological collapses and transformations. So Maja spends her time building models at the interface between social and ecological processes. And that has been one of the early areas where, in a way, complex systems approaches became applied to issues that matter. And so she will report about some of the findings.
All right, well, thank you very much for the introduction and also the invitation to talk here. I would like to talk about a few examples of using a complexity in a social-ecological perspective to study sustainability problems and how such a perspective might help us think differently how to navigate them. And I very, very much want to highlight particularly the aspects that you mentioned in the introduction, that the human environment systems we live in are really continuously changing and co-evolving. And we need to pay much more attention to this processes of coevolution. But also that they're really deeply intertwined. So it's not only multiple links between, or couplings between systems, it's really one system that is co-constituted by social and ecological processes. So I'm going to talk about examples of collapses and transformation, and I've picked kind of the prototypical, or some of the prototypical examples that have been studied a lot to kind of see how a complexity perspective, what additionally or what new can we actually learn and how can that help us further. There are going to be examples of resource collapse. I myself have worked a lot on the disappearance of the Aral Sea, and that actually got me into complexity thinking more than 20 years ago. But also the typical kind of toxic algae blooms, fisheries collapse, and situations in which the systems are stuck in a very unsustainable but persistent state, and how can we navigate out of it, such as poverty traps. Poverty traps in the Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan, for example. And very much in line of the previous talk also, how can we understand management and policy making as a coevolutionary process? So how do policies emerge and how are they maintained? Or how do they lead to the different outcomes? So hopefully that will help us think a little bit about the pathways, how we could actually get to those visions that we might want to get to. So resource collapse, or often also in the social-ecological community called regime shifts, have been studied intensively, particularly focusing on kind of the ecological feedbacks that maintain these systems in two or several alternative states, the switches between them and the thresholds, and how can we kind of anticipate or kind of develop indicators that show us how close are we to such a transition, right? However, while these systems are actually starting to transition and between two different states, humans interact with them. So we wanted to ask the question, how does a regime shift actually evolve if we take into account that humans are interacting with a changing system? And we're using the example of the cod collapse in the Baltic in the 80s. It's well understood how food web interactions between sprat, herring, and cod basically shifted from a cod-dominated to a sprat-dominated system, driven by salinity changes, temperature changes, and of course, human pressure. However, human pressure has mainly been considered as like a driver of that change in the ecological system. But as we know, humans interact and adapt to changes or not, while it is kind of evolving. So, of course, these fishers are taking decisions on how much to fish, whether to go to fish and how much to fish. New ones might actually be attracted. And they take these decisions within social and ecological context. These social contexts really going from the psychology, how they perceive the state of the fish population. There was a cod boom before there was a collapse. So there was this perception of overabundance of cod that we just need to harvest, and which led to subsidies, which led to kind of investments in the fishing fleets and so forth. But also, of course, the changing ecological system that changes through those interactions. That might be perceived or not. In that case, it wasn't perceived for a long time. So if we can study those, so we studied those interactions, and one of the insights we got from that coupled perspective was that the adaptive responses of the fissures actually managed to slow down the collapse and stabilize an already unstable ecological system until ecological nonlinearities took over and the rigidity of kind of the social system led to the collapse. So it's really critical to better understand the social ecological interactions that stabilize or destabilize the system to be able to then identify effective measures to prevent or reverse the shift. And actually, if we look at many ecosystems today, a lot of them actually in transition to possibly a more undesirable state. But these transitions, as I emphasized before, they're evolving over time, right? They're taking certain time to take place. So some of you might be familiar with this picture to the right, which is kind of an equilibrium kind of based view onto how these systems change, where you can see at different values of the human driver, the system will either be in a clear or a turbid state. So this work is now, we're shifting to a lake in southern Sweden that inspired that. This work where the municipalities around that lake actually try to restore the lake towards a desirable state, a clear water state. So while an equilibrium-based analysis would say that once you're beyond that point up there, you will just inevitably end up in the turbid state. We would say no, there's actually time, and it needs time until the ecological feedbacks of the turbid state actually get really strong. And that time actually opens up an opportunity for intervening, if you want to use that word, or interact with the system doing this. So of course, first of all, the timing of your policy response when you actually realize something is going wrong and you want to change it obviously will matter. The later you respond, the stronger already the new state, the more likely, or the faster, or the more difficult it will be actually to reverse. But also the speed of the implementation. So how quickly do you actually manage, in this case it's nutrient inflows, right, that drive this shift towards the turbid lake. How fast you reverse, or how fast you can reduce nutrient input. And these dynamics are often not considered when we look at regime shifts. So in that particular case, in a very stylized kind of picture, we looked at the timing of the policy by the municipality, which is very much informed by either their management norms or whenever they're able to actually justify taking action, like forbidding recreational, so certain measures at the lake. But also taking into account that it actually takes time until the people that are affected by that policy actually implement it. In this case, it was house owners needing to upgrade their sewage system. So through this analysis, we could learn, as I said before, the timing of the policy, that's not surprising. Timing of the policy matters, right? But also this implementation process matters, not only by its speed, but also by the shape. Like, is the updating going quickly or slower? So the details or how that process unravels can have significant nonlinear effects on actually whether it's possible and how long it takes to restore the lake. So a focus on the social-ecological interaction during the transitions can actually open up opportunities for navigating them towards a more sustainable pathway, right? And in this case, for example, a late timing of a policy could be compensated through certain social measures or mechanisms to implement the policy in a faster way. So I want to stay on this topic of transience and kind of the co-evolutionary notion a little bit longer, and actually pick up what Carlo was talking about, the co-evolutionary dynamics of policy processes, where we actually I would say in most settings, maybe all settings, but definitely in democratic countries, a policy process is dynamic and evolving. And it is a process where different interests compete. And these different interests, they of course represent different values regarding, we're looking at environmental policy making here, right? So different values or visions of what the social-ecological, what's valuable in the social-ecological system, right? So the environmental policies then emerge from the competition of these different interests, within particular, of course, institutional settings, but also within particular ecological dynamics, right? Captured in a very extremely simplified picture here, as for example, we studied this in the context of the EU Common Fisheries Policy. So the interest groups compete, the interest group compete for influence on the policymakers through lobbying and coalition formation. And the policymakers decide on a fishing policy in that case, which of course changes the state of the fishery, which will be picked up, that change will different signals of that change will be picked up by the different interest groups. Let's say industry groups pick up more the economic performance. Environmental groups will be more concerned about the state of the fish population. So these different signals will lead to different action by the different interests in forms of coalition formation, which affects how they influence. And we can go on that. And one of the insights we got from that work was really that, do I have it? Yeah. That we can see that under some conditions, the competing interests actually can lead to sustainable outcomes. In other conditions, they cannot. And then, of course, it's interesting to understand what are those conditions. And some of them relate to, or when we see sustainable outcomes, they're actually the result of a kind of tug-of-war dynamic of competing different interests, kind of pushing the system into their directions, the other react, they push it into, or pull it into their direction, it goes back and forth like that. But these tug-of-war dynamics are only effective, and that's actually political sciences describe kind of these tug-of-war dynamics. They're only effective if actually the fish population hasn't already entered kind of a declining slope. So the timing matters, the kind of random chance events of some. We also found that poorer groups matter, detail I can't go into right now, but kind of how these processes play out over time can lead to very, very different outcomes. So my last example is about poverty traps as kind of situations of persistent poverty, which has been, of course, let's say, a long-standing problem that has been kind of, what do we say, analyzed, or let's say one of the dominant models from economics looking at poverty traps is that it is a situation with, again, multiple stable states, a low well-being and a high well-being state, and that basically one needs to push the system into the high well-being state. And this is kind of a little bit the worldview or the thinking that underlies like big push interventions, right? You just need to push and give people the opportunity, and then they will just move into this other equilibrium. However, a lot of the contexts in which we see poverty are actually rural areas where we have agriculture or fisheries or something. So poverty traps in rural areas are really the result of interacting economic, ecological, and cultural dynamics, and that play out very differently in different contexts. So what poverty alleviation strategies, whether it is a big push, which in some contexts has worked, in many it has failed, or whether we need much other transformative alleviation strategies, will of course depend on context, and that's been said many times. But can we identify something in that context that helps us make those decisions? And what we focused on here was kind of looking at poverty-environment relationships. And it's often implicitly assumed that in poor situations, you would degrade the environment and it's degraded. But you have many examples like the one here in the Parme Mountains, where actually the agriculture maintains high cultural and biological diversity. So given the context, there's diverse poverty-environment relationships, and they will need diverse alleviation pathways. But we can use simple models and thinking to kind of try to understand what are kind of, can we get at a typology or something of these different contexts for that. So I wanted to illustrate kind of a few aspects of the complexity and social or intertwinedness of these systems, and how we can like go about an understanding and informing kind of how we deal with those systems through that. And these systems are really inherently complex adaptive systems. They continuously change what some people have called kind of dynamism. So we really need to focus on their transient or on this continuous change rather than on equilibria and stabilized. The processes are emergent, so it's the interactions of many actors shape the context while at the same time being shaped by the context. So the emergent context that these actors create, the actors at the same time adapt to. So we can't really separate this. I would also argue that this intertwinedness is a key aspect. It's the key at the core of sustainability problems, let's say it that way. We shape the systems that we govern. I think it's more, of course, intertwinedness is part of complexity, but I think it actually is more than complexity. Or it has other dimensions to it that I want to come to in my last slide. And finally, these problems are wicked. There's multiple problem understandings. There's no one optimal solution. So how do we deal with those multiple problem understanding? How can they help us inform and understand, for example, the uncertainty that we're facing? So in order to kind of understand kind of the emergence of social-ecological phenomena from these social-ecological interactions and providing a tool to kind of think through different possible ways these phenomena could emerge, we've developed a framework that basically serves as an analytical tool to develop hypotheses to explain a phenomena. For example, the cod collapse or something. So departing from this view that these systems are networks of social-ecological interactions, we say we can abstract from that through looking at configurations of action situations, building on Ostrom's work on action situations. And these configurations of action situations are one possible hypothesis of how such a phenomena, or we can develop several hypotheses of how such a phenomena emerged. So just a brief walking through the cod collapse, for example. We, of course, have interactions between cod and sprat influenced by fishing pressure, but they actually influence the interactions between fishers and cod when they fish, but also their perception of that. This will influence the policy-making interactions within political arenas, but also, of course, economic transactions. And together, these different interactions, through their emergent outcomes, the outcome of one action situation that emerges sets, for example, the rules or the constraints of another action situation, or influences participants or their shared participants between action situations. And that together kind of, we think is a tool to help us think through kind of emergent phenomena. So with the last slide, I want to zoom out even a little bit more and also talk about how we do science, how we study these issues, these complex sustainability problems, and how we also kind of navigate them. And it reminds your talk about the decision theater kind of reminded me a lot of that. But we really need collaborative, and I mean a lot of participatory or action research. This message has come already a long way, but I think within science we could apply a lot of that understanding and thinking actually in how we do science and how we understand science in the sustainability sense of being transdisciplinary. But that we actually need collaborative, iterative, and multi-method processes where we actually use the available understanding, for example, from case studies, case synthesis, from kind of synthesizing across available knowledge from very, very different perspectives. To develop possible explanation, use modeling, particular simulations, to experiment with them, to scrutinize them, to unravel, kind of compare different. We don't want to integrate everything. We might want to compare different perspectives, to then reshape our thinking, maybe go back into the field, and really embed this whole iterative process within multiple methods. In this case, and that was also the 4 examples I brought, was combining empirical, in-depth, or synthetic work with different types of dynamic modeling, actually, in that case. And all this within collaborative processes between disciplines, but of course also between disciplines and other knowledge systems. So to conclude or summarize, basically, the dynamism of this system, the fact that change is endogenous, and it's the rule and not the exception. So we're not looking for equilibrium, the stability, when we're trying to understand the change. The interaction of context and the relations, or how relations between social and ecological actors in a system basically shape context, and how context shape those relations is really central and creates those emergent phenomena and dynamics. In order to kind of understand and act upon this, we need new conceptual tools, but we might also need new paradigms. A lot of implicitly of our thinking is grounded in thinking about stability. It's grounded in kind of the dichotomy between social and ecological. And that puts a lot of barriers in how we can actually think about those systems as like one co-evolving unit. I mean, we still say social hyphen ecological, right? We don't even have a word that kind of doesn't make that separation, right? Some people have been talking about or promoting process philosophy, or kind of changing from nouns to verbs as one possible way forward. I'm sure there's others. And my last point, kind of, we need a truly collaborative science. And that's not, I mean, all of you know that's not an easy thing to do, right, and interdisciplinary. But we need to really establish these methodologies and engage in continuous learning processes that will help us to not reduce the uncertainty necessarily, but get a better understanding of what are sources of that uncertainty and what are the implications of those. Right, and all I presented here was actually the result of lots of collaborative work of my team and beyond. All right, thank you.